this should be, yeah, that's everyone seeing. So we're looking today at, I've called it sort of title of being a PEM detective. For those who don't know, by this what I'm meaning is post-exertional malaise. So if you have long COVID, you don't necessarily have post-exertional malaise, but it's common. It's probably more than 50%, maybe as high as 70-ish% of people with long COVID have post-exertional malaise as part of their long COVID. Broadly speaking, this is sort of an issue where you do an activity or something that is tiring and you get a prolonged impact of that with sort of symptoms that can last sort of 2, 3, 6, potentially longer days sort of afterwards. And it's something that's quite unusual with sort of ME/CFS and sort of long COVID and a few other post-viral conditions. But that's sort of what we're talking about. Now, often it's going to be very obvious as soon as you realize that you do experience post-exertional malaise, what the problem is. And it's going to be simply a case that in the last day, the last 2 days, the last week, the last few hours, you've done too much. And often once you understand that you have a limit on how much energy you have, and that you kind of pay an unfair and serious price for doing too much, you'll often realize that that's what the problem is, but it won't always be so clear. And one thing that can make it a lot harder is I've sort of talked about the noise in my notes here, where people are in the sort of boom bust cycle where they maybe do things some days and then have no energy others, where they don't have like a balancing of energy on a day-to-day basis. They can be in a sort of a position where they don't really have a connection between cause and effect because they might have done 4 things within the last 3 days that massively overexert themselves, and they're not sure where the problems lie and what things they maybe got away with. So one of the things that can really help in working out what is causing issues is to try as much as possible to work within what you can safely do in terms of your energy envelope, and also in terms of avoiding the things that are most fatiguing and most triggering post-exertional malaise. So that's kind of like the starting point. And once people are doing that, then a lot of these other things I'm going to talk about, they can start really kind of showing and making a bit of a difference in terms of picking up where their sort of problems lie. So I'm going to cover activity diaries in a bit more of a bit more detail. Activity diaries are a really useful tool. A lot of people who experience post-exertional malaise have short-term memory problems. And if you've got short-term memory problems, then it can be very hard to know what you did this morning, let alone yesterday or the day before or a week ago. So if you're trying to sort of work out what you've done that might be causing you problems, it can be very helpful to actually know what you've been doing. Often what you can do is you can backtrack if so you might feel awful when you wake up one morning, you're feeling awful. You might be able to look back at what you've done in the last 12 hours, 48 hours, or even longer. And sometimes there can be like a key thing. Oh yes, I did such and such. And that can be a really good indication that that was maybe what might have been triggering sort of your symptoms. Something else that's really important is to listen to your body and mind for clues. Quite often, some people might remember from last week, I looked at, it was the Workwell Foundation. They have a post-exertional malaise flow chart. And what it kind of shows is that you might experience some symptoms sort of straight away, some symptoms a little bit further on, a few hours, a few days, and then you may still experience some issues sort of a week or so after something that's triggered post-exertional malaise. But quite often there are things you can pick up initially, and the more you're aware of your post-exertional malaise, the more you're able to learn what they are for you and pick up on them. So it might be in my case, when I've kind of overextended myself, I stumble a lot more. I slur my speech. I forget what I'm saying mid-sentence. I can get headaches. I can be dizzy. I can be breathless, and there can be other sort of things I can pick up on when I'm doing sort of like promptly doing like some mental tasks. Occasionally, I will pause and I'll do sort of like I occasionally play chess where I won't play like a whole match live, but I might do like a chess puzzle or a move in a match that I've got 3 days to make a move. And if when I'm looking at that, I can kind of tell, oh, my brain's really not working at all, something like that can be an indication that I need to stop. It is different for each of us. You've kind of got to learn what your own symptoms are, but it is something that I think most people develop, you know, over time. I didn't have it in the first 6 months or a year or so of being ill, but it kind of developed beyond that. And I think if you're listening for it and looking out for it, and just kind of like not denying it, it can be easy to decide that something isn't a symptom if you want to do it. So you kind of need to be take a step back and think, is this something I should be? It's is my body, or am I, or are the things that are trying to tell me I'm maybe doing something I shouldn't be doing or should stop doing? We're going to cover heart rate monitoring in more detail. I wear a heart rate monitor, and it's only something I started doing probably about 9.5 years into being ill with ME. And I kind of felt like, why didn't I do this a lot sooner? Because it's really been incredibly helpful. I'll cover that in a bit more detail. And also the same with heart rate variability. It's another sort of really useful tool. Um, and also we'll look at feedback from others, because that also can be really, really helpful. But one thing I do want to stress is, I mean, I come from a position of privilege where I got ill. Within a month of being ill, I had my first appointment with
Rufus, I've just said
and I was able to get professional help very, very quickly. And most people don't get that. I then where I am, I'm co-chair of a charity Stockport ME group, and before I started with the charity, they actually got funding in place for a specialist service which got taken over by the NHS. So I was able to access that service. There was a year wait, but I still was able to access that service and get a lot of support. And it's support that a lot of people, unfortunately, don't get, however long they. Um, so need to bear with me. My daughter's just come home from brownies. There'll be a little bit of background noise for a minute or two. So I do want to stress that when we're sort of looking at sort of trying to work out what's causing post-exertional malaise, a key thing to bear in mind is that we don't have the same amount of energy each day. So if you've got a cold, if you've got a bug, you're going to have less energy than you did before. If you've overexerted yourselves from what you've done over the last few days or weeks, you're going to have less energy, and that can really affect what's going to cause post-exertional malaise. So if you're in a crash period, probably almost everything you do will be triggering PEM. So going to the toilet, sitting up, eating, drinking, everything has the potential of causing and triggering post-exertional malaise if you're in that sort of extreme sort of state. But just that when we're looking at some of the things we're going on to, these are sort of generalities a little bit on what an average day is, and you will need to kind of adjust that a little bit downwards if you're having other issues to sort of deal with. And having something like a cold, even if you don't have any respiratory problems, even just that can lower your energy levels. Some people have found it really helpful to look at changes in your heart rate variability or your resting heart rate, as these can be indicative of having less energy. And that can be a sort of a good point if you're trying to evaluate what you can do in a day at the sort of beginning of the day. So they're not things I do myself, but they are things that many people have found to be helpful. Now look into activity diaries in a bit more detail. Now, activity diaries are an incredibly useful tool, but I think they are at their best when you actually are in a one-to-one with someone where they are looking through your diaries with you. Because if you're just doing them yourself, are you doing them consistently? Are you really looking at them? Are you seeing what you want to see or what's really there? It can be sort of very difficult to sort of look at them yourself. Now, if it's very, very quick notes, so that when you know, if you happen to feel bad on one day, you can look back later on and think, well, maybe what was causing this? It has the potential in some situations to be helpful, but whilst it's something that you know every book on pacing will recommend, I do just sort of want to put it out there that it's very hard to really use these well on your own. Now you can do them in lots of different ways. You can use there's apps you can use specifically for tracking for pacing. You can use a spreadsheet, you can use a scrap of paper. There's lots of different ways you can do. And if nobody else is looking at activity diary, it doesn't really matter what you do as long as it works for you. Um, I do intend on doing a full session on activity diaries. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do this. I probably will get access to a few people will share their activity diaries with me, and I'll work out a way of putting that together. Because I do think it is something that if you're trying to get the most information out of it, probably need a bit of help. But maybe if I kind of show you some and show you how I could maybe make some suggestions around that, then maybe that will work and be useful information for some of you. I talked earlier about having a heart rate monitor. One of the interesting things with heart rate monitors is that your heart rate can be a good indication of activity levels. It's not 100% accurate. It doesn't track mental and cognitive activities quite as effectively as physical, but it does actually quite a good job. So that if you are trying to keep a rough track of what you've been doing, but maybe there's gaps, if you do have a smartwatch and you are sort of tracking your heart rate, it can do a good job of filling in the gaps. It can show you things that you did that maybe where heart rate was pretty high, and that might be able to think of what you were doing at the time. It can be a useful aid if you are looking to do activity diaries and get the most out of it. One thing I would stress is it's very easy to do activity diary where you look at what an hour is. And in quite a few, if I go back to the previous page, you can see, and this is common, unfortunately, with most activity diaries, you might not be able to see because it's not mega clear, but there's like one line or two lines. Now I've got my dog coming up to join me, making always make trying to record things in this house is a little bit tricky. One or two lines, and it can be tricky. But what I would stress is that you could do a task that takes you 5 minutes and it completely exhausts you for an hour. Taking the bins out, in my case, probably takes less than 5 minutes. But that, if it's more than one bin, that could wipe me out for half an hour or so. So it is important that when you're tracking activity diaries, you don't kind of think of time as being like 5 minutes isn't the same. It might be 50 minutes of quite a low level activity is, about on par with 5 minutes of actually something that's quite physical. So you want to make sure that where you are doing activities that are kind of like quite full on, that they're adequately shown in how you're recording. Um, I've already kind of covered a lot about listening and feeling to being picking up for clues from yourself. One thing I'll sort of say is that, and I'm going to cover this a bit later, there are things that can make it harder. Things like caffeine, sugar, they can all kind of make it harder to know how an activity is affecting you. And so there's a lot of people for that reason, they say, oh, you should maybe not have coffee or watch what you're having with stimulants. I take a slightly broader view, which is if you're going to take coffee, you're going to take sugar, you're going to do these sort of things, just be mindful that then you can't rely on what your body's telling you so much, because you're taking things that are going to give you the impression of having more energy than you perhaps do. So you maybe need to be thinking more in terms of, how time spent in activity, heart rate monitors and things like that for hints. I will I'm going to do a separate session on heart rate monitoring. I'm actually running a program, a research project on heart rate monitoring in conjunction with the Workwell Foundation, University of Liverpool, Physios for ME, and some others. And I got involved with this because I've kind of found heart rate monitoring was really an effective tool, but it was quite hard to kind of learn how to use. There was not a lot of easy to use guides out there, although the Workwell Foundation information is very good. Some of the things that they recommend are very, very hard to stick to. But with heart rate monitoring, in some ways it can work a bit like a fire alarm. You can set an alarm that will potentially warn you of things that you might be doing that could be exceeding your aerobic threshold. Workwell did some research and they kind of found through exercise testing, you could work out in a given day what someone's aerobic threshold was. And if people exceeded that, they were very likely to be triggering post-exertion malaise if it was for at least a couple of minutes. And that they've sort of found through some simple calculations, you can get a reasonable approximation of what your aerobic threshold will be, and then sort of try to sort of stick within it. So in this, I wish you could see my cursor. I don't think you can. And for me, my aerobic threshold is probably around the sort of 98 level. So you can see on this given day, I'm sleeping till sort of 8 in the morning. So it's pretty low then. But there's a couple of times, probably walking the dog, where I've maybe exceeded my aerobic threshold. And when this happens, thank you. Can't see my cursor good. When this happens, you can set it so an alarm will go off and it will warn you. Now, sometimes that can be unhelpful if you're doing something that you need to do, like I'm taking my daughter to school. I can't stop partway through taking my daughter to school. She's got to get to school, and I can't just sit on the street until I feel better. But there's other times where I'll be doing jobs about the house and I can stop myself and go and rest, where otherwise I'd have carried on. So it can work a little bit like a fire alarm, protecting you from doing something that could do you harm or cause harm. Also, looking at the data over the course of a day, it can give a very good idea of whether you're pacing well. So are you getting, in this particular day, you can see that there's a lot of time, I maybe have a very sharp peak and then a moderate amount to rest. And then there's a period of about 3 hours where I don't really get much by way of rest. Then I do get a rest, and then it's kind of a bit peak, so I get some sort of rest there. But you can kind of see, but just by looking at it, you can get an indication of how well you're pacing in that day. When you are resting, and you kind of want to be relatively close to your resting heart rate. So at the moment, my resting heart rate is about 55. It's a little bit higher at the moment. But so in this case, you can see that from waking up, I never really in this day get close to that. Normally, I do a much better job of pacing, but in this given day, not particularly. But it can be useful information, and for pacing in general, but it can also help to work out when you are overexerting and when you're going to be sort of triggering post-exertion malaise. Predominantly, the alarm can help with this. If you set an alarm to warn you if you're going over a certain threshold, but also just by sort of looking through the data and seeing, are you getting the rest and things that you need. So I'm going to do a session where I cover this in a lot more detail. I've got a sort of a guide I'm working on that's still in relatively rough form. If anybody wants it, I can potentially email that out to people. It's about sort of 30-ish pages. It's quite substantial, but it kind of walks through a bit more detail of, how heart monitoring can assist and how I recommend people go about it. If you are trying to work out what your aerobic threshold are, there's two main approaches that go about. One is looking at your resting heart rate and adding a number, normally 15, to it. That is very hard for a lot of people to keep to. But it's quite a cautious amount, and it can be useful if people are able to keep within that. I tend to use the age-based formula, which this is a gender-adapted version of. The original formula was kind of more geared around men, but this one works for anybody. Um, some people use different formulas. What I would say is it's quite easy to be within the age-based formula. So you are below that and you are triggering post-exertional malaise, particularly with mental or emotional or cognitive tasks, but it can still warn you in a useful way um, in some of those instances. There's a number of times I've been doing activities where I'm lying down and the alarm goes off. Sometimes even I think I'm resting and it goes off, and then I'm like, actually I wasn't resting. I was thinking about things that I wasn't even trying to think of. Or maybe in some instances I've been quite emotional about something, and I kind of realized, well, I can still feel those feelings, but maybe find a way of doing so in a sort of a calmer, less exhausting way. Um, Now, I don't personally use heart rate variability, and the reason I don't is because I got ME 10 years ago. A few people were using it then, but devices were much harder to get hold of. They were much less accurate. And I've kind of developed my own ways of picking up on when I am in a situation where I'm having a bad day, lower energy, etc. It's still something I might try to use at some point, and it's something that can be very helpful, I think, particularly in your early days of learning to pace, because it's something else that gives a little bit of an external indication of, am I having a good day or not? How much energy do I have? And also gives an indication of if you're having a low sort of pacing score, in this case, this is from Visible on the right, then maybe I overdid it the last day, 2 days ago. And in terms of working out what's causing your post-exertional malaise, it gives clues that can help you work it out. It's not just depending on how you're feeling, because how you're feeling can be distorted a bit by, a good example of this is somebody has had a week where they barely got out of bed and everything's been a struggle. Then they have a couple of days where they feel able to do more. They feel really positive about life. They're doing more. They can be a little bit more ambitious in what they're doing. They're feeling really positive, but they might be overdoing it and they might be paying for it over the next couple of days. So particularly when you're in that sort of situation, using something like heart rate variability can assist um, in helping giving you a tool or an X-ray of checking how much energy do you have and what might be causing post-exertional malaise. Workwell Foundation, I covered this in an earlier slide very briefly. They've also sort of noticed that changes in your resting heart rate can also be sort of indicative of being in a sort of low energy sort of place. If there's a significant change in your resting heart rate up or down, that can be indicative of you having overexerted and maybe needing to cut back on what you do and rest more in a given day. It cannot, I mean, changing your medication can also change these things. So you have to sort of look at the sort of holistic view of everything that's happening with you, but it can be helpful. Um, I I do also really recommend that people do consider, if they have access, professionals to assist with pacing. There's a lot of things I wouldn't have picked up on myself. I think one big problem is that many of us have cognitive deficits. We have brain fog. It can be very hard to read and absorb information or taking in information if you're listening to it or watching people talking. It's also really hard because pacing isn't something that you just do for 10 minutes. Earlier on, I was doing some breath work. It's very easy. I press a button, I follow the protocol, it stops and it's done. I just need to remember to do it and do it with the right frequency. But pacing is kind of like 24 hours a day all the time. And a lot of what you're doing with pacing is actually changing and adapting your life. And that's really difficult to do. We've got our own resistances, we've got our own biases, we've got our own things that we're very attached to. And it can be hard to navigate that on our own. And professionals, if you have the right ones, can make a massive difference. I've been very lucky and I've got some really understanding and supportive friends and family. So my wife will, for instance, pick up on when I'm doing too much and she'll say, you're not making sense. You need to go lie down. She'll say, I don't think you should do that. That's going to overexert you. she will sort of both pick up on some cues I might miss, either because they're not apparent to me or because I don't want to see them. And even my daughter, who's 8, she can often pick up on these things. And again, she understands about pacing, and she will help me to pace. Um, my PAs, one of my PAs I recruited from the ME community. And if I'm out doing something, she will be sort of saying, will know what might trigger my post-exertion malaise and would warn me. I've kind of trained up some of my other PAs a little bit with that too. So potentially you can get a lot of help. And the other thing I would stress, we have what, 34 people here in long COVID support. We've got 60,000 odd people. Not everyone there needs to pace, but many do, and many have experience of working out what's caused problems for them, and they've found solutions. So really, you've got a whole community you can draw on for support. There's one key thing that I'd sort of missed in sort of notes just sort of cover now, and that's a key thing to remember is prior experience. So you might do a task and it causes post-exertional malaise. That doesn't mean it's always going to do that, but it means that it's relatively likely to do that again. So if, I've learned how far I can walk without triggering, I think even small distances will trigger issues, but there'll be issues that I recover from quite quickly. Whereas if I walk more than a certain amount, that's too far. I know I can do a certain length of dog walking a day that will wipe me out for an hour or so, but any longer and the consequences will be a lot more extreme. And I know that if I'm having a slightly worse day energy wise, I need to lower what I can do there. So you kind of learn what you can do and adapt that around your sort of base level. So you kind of know what is safe for you to do and what is risky and what just shouldn't be done at all. I do I feel like I've talked a little bit longer than I intended, but I'm coming quite near the end. I do want to touch on a few things. I've kind of hinted on some before. There's lots of things, medication, painkillers, caffeine, sugar, all of the potential to mask symptoms. And I'm not saying don't take these, but some people, one of their main sort of triggers or warning signs when they're experiencing post-exertional malaise is pain. So if it's mild pain, sometimes painkillers can mask that, and just be aware of that. And then if you're taking them, be a little bit more cautious in your activity levels. I'd also kind of want to highlight a big issue that I had, which is there can be other medical causes. So sometimes you might pick up on something. The issue might not be post-exertional malaise. So in my case, I have dysautonomia. So I have problems sitting and standing that are relieved by lying down. And for about 10 years, maybe 9.5 years, I certainly had ME, but I also had dysautonomia, and it wasn't diagnosed and it wasn't being treated. So some of the times where I thought, oh, I can't do that, it's causing post-exertional malaise. What was actually happening was I was having problems standing. I needed to be either doing things like drinking water or increasing my salt, or lying down more, and then I would have been able to do more. Similarly, I've had had issues around food sensitivities where during mealtime I'd sometimes have to stop and go and lie down without finishing a meal, or I'd feel awful for half an hour, 2 hours after eating. And I discovered that I had a lot of food sensitivities, and when I adapted my diet, my energy levels improved a lot. So I was triggering PEM from eating, but in some ways it wasn't just because of eating, it was because of what I was eating. And in some of these cases, there's not the medical support out there, you've got to discover it in yourself. And in other cases, I just encourage people to get medical advice and look at those issues, because not everything is post-exertional malaise. There can be many other causes. And finally, I want to touch a little bit on, a lot of what today's been about is helping identify the problem, but it's not actually helping that much with the solution. So the simplest bit of advice I can give people who are experiencing post-exertional malaise is that if you're experiencing it, it's because you're doing too much generally, or specifically you're doing some activities or tasks, and they can be just feeling things or be anxious. It's not necessarily, an actual task. So try to do less. But if you've identified something, and the next session we'll be looking at this in a lot more detail, looking at trying to do it less often, avoid doing it where possible, stop doing it sooner. Look for different ways of